Over the last month, my subscribers have been sending in their own original alien designs. I asked people to submit 2 different versions of 2 types of aliens, and for the people that I ended up picking, I would take one of their submissions and turn them into Xenomorphs to fit into today's story. But today's story isn't actually going to be narrated by Bustar Terminax, the usual narrator of my Xenomorph episodes, though he will be involved in the story. It's actually going to be narrated by another of my original characters, Dresden, who's been a bit conflicted about a big decision he needs to make, and maybe he's made that decision as of today. I'll also show off the other things submitted and announce the next 2 community redraws at the end of this episode, but for now, let's get into the story, shall we? Let's go!
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
I did not anticipate this decision being so difficult. I had, with no exaggeration, been working towards it for thousands of years, though admittedly the details varied wildly over that time. For the last 20 years or so, I thought everything was finally falling into place, until that vexingly optimistic Sterling and Geel began inflicting doubt in the morality of my goal. Though, frankly, I always knew it was a somewhat flawed plan. It was only on the day I was called to Dimension C284 recently that a series of events took place which finally forced me to make a final decision on the matter. You see, this dimension is usually locked off from multiversal travel. I once made an agreement with the overseer of that world, who takes on the form of a collective of beings working as something they call the Safety Commission. They allowed me to leave a set of old, failed experiments of mine, the Biomex, which I'm sure you're familiar with, on a moon of their universe, to ensure no other overseers would find them. Of course, that eventually backfired, but regardless, I still owed a debt to the Safety Commission that they called in on this day. You see, the Dimension C284 is one of the most expansive in the multiverse, with trillions of lives within it across thousands of planets. This makes it very difficult for an overseer to watch, let alone control, as the Safety Commission attempts to do. Frankly, I am ashamed to have ever put myself in their debt. They quite literally take over the minds of innocent beings to add into their collective. And even still, they felt the need to call in my aid to rid themselves of an entity they were simply calling the Xenoforge, though they had never actually seen it. They weren't even certain what it was, though they knew it had the ability to seemingly randomly transport alien life forms from across their universe to itself and promptly infect them with the egg of a Xenomorph, a horrendous breed of creature I once faced in my own world, prior to becoming an overseer myself. You see, Xenomorphs incubate their young in the bodies of living beings and creatures, and when they emerge from their host, they brutally kill them, usually bursting from their chest and taking on traits of whatever creature they grew inside of. The Commission had even destroyed entire planets on which they knew the Forge to be, but it seemed it could transport itself away when under threat of destruction, or possibly even that there were multiple of it, as it would soon after be reported to have found a new home on a new planet, and still be taking and infecting innocent beings. And so the Commission stopped attempting to destroy it from afar and put a bounty on it. But no bounty hunter in the galaxy, even after 3 years, had managed to find and destroy it, hence calling in my aid. As you know, I have a well-built reputation for containing dangerous beings, entities, and devices such as this, though often they are simply brought to me for imprisonment, and I am not tasked with retrieving them myself. I told the Commission that with the amount of Xenomorph creatures known to be constantly on guard of the device, I stood very little chance of succeeding in this mission alone, and so I requested that I bring an ally to assist me, another overseer, the only one I trust. Or trusted, I suppose. They refused at first, adamantly stating their disdain for other overseers and universes in general. But oddly enough, when I mentioned that the ally I wanted to bring was the overseer of Dimension D667, their tone changed. They accepted but refused to explain why she was an exception to their hatred. And so I called in the only ally I've consistently kept over the last few decades. well, I tend to address her by her given name. She would not be pleased if I shared that with you, so I will refer to her by her more common title of Fear herself. While I was confused and curious as to how the Safety Commission was aware of her, I was, admittedly, happy to have a mission alongside her. Fear may be an overseer and a cruel one at times, but at least she has a strong moral code that she sticks to that I can respect. Or, at least that is the excuse I've used for so long to forgive all those she torments and kills with the demons she makes. Anyhow, Fear explained away quite quickly and convincingly that the Safety Commission allowed her to create and test some of her demons on abandoned worlds of C284. Most overseers will use the world known as the Everyverse to do this, but given she had no interest in coming across other overseers, whom she is not particularly fond of either, she wanted another place to go where she could not be disturbed by their kind. I inquired as to what the Safety Commission got out of this deal, and admittedly I noticed how dismissive her response was and didn't question further, as I should have. For our venture, I brought along one of my 2 shards of the multiversal orb to enhance both our abilities if need be. In the past, I had occasionally allowed Fear to borrow the shards I possessed, but she far too often made passing mentions about wanting to use them to create physical forms for entities called the Archons, demons that have no place living in our plane of existence. On that day, since she had not used it in some time, I assumed she'd be eager to hear I'd brought the shard for us to utilize as a power enhancement. And yet, she was oddly passive on the matter. Another sign I too easily ignored that something was awry. I suppose our desire to see someone in a positive light can often cloud our judgment when they reveal their darkness to us. Prior to departing on our mission, we bickered about our usual topics. She referred to me as her love, as she makes a regular habit of doing, and I reminded her once more that if she truly wanted our relationship to become something other than platonic, she'd have to cease taking on the form of a 15-year-old child. She is several hundred years old, after all, but as usual, she stated that the form of a little girl can be much more unsettling for many in her efforts to strike fear into the hearts of those she appears before. We chuckled about how many times we had had this same conversation. I know it would likely sound strange to you given your knowledge of the things Fear has done, and not that you would trust my perspective anyhow, but she is not an evil being. Though I acknowledge that her actions do provide ample evidence to the contrary. We transported ourselves to the surface of the planet where the Xenoforge was known to be presently, arriving in the region where most bounty hunter tracking signals had gone dead. The world was a storm-ridden planet with neon green clouds casting a sickly light over purple mountainous terrain. We appeared immediately in front of a wide cavern mouth that descended into the planet. I was going to use the orb shard to scan the ground beneath us to see if there was a powerful energy source below, but before I could make the attempt, we heard the unmistakable shrieking of Xenomorphs echoing from the depths. Mixed in along with that was the grunting and yelling of a clearly frustrated combatant. I hesitated to engage, but Fear floated on into the cave to join in the battle. I followed after to see that indeed one bounty hunter had managed to survive to continue his hunt for the Xenoforge. We found the hunter surrounded by what I thought were Xenomorph corpses at first. He was clearly skilled, but his strength seemed to be waning as he faced a final threat in this battle. It was a Xenomorph with a teal hide, as well as an armored metallic head and backplates. I was ready to offer assistance, but Fear was more eager. She thrust her hands to the floor and veins of black flesh sprawled across the terrain and emerged as tendrils beneath the creature, wrapping its limbs, ready to tear it apart. But as she started to pull, the hunter, oddly enough, twirled his flame-spewing staff around and stabbed the other end into one of the tentacles, electrocuting it. This, of course, did little aside from irritating Fear, who then struck her other hand down and wrapped the hunter in more tendrils, asking,
Is that how you say thank you where you're from, Catboy?
He retorted by saying, "You kill that beautiful critter and I'll have you unconscious along with these other Xenos, kid." It was only then that I noticed none of the Xenomorph bodies scattered around were dismembered or maimed, but that all had some sort of metallic blinking disc stuck to them. As it turned out, this hunter had received a set of 10 discs from an alien race that he worked alongside that could render creatures such as Xenomorphs unconscious, though they would awaken within 10 minutes or so of having the disc removed. 2 of these discs had been broken in the half-dozen battles he'd already fought through that day, and the other 8 were in use on the Xenomorphs scattering the ground. Apparently, this so-called hunter had decided some time ago to stop killing the creatures that he hunted, and instead take them to reside on a nature reserve planet called Ishkonigan Major. It seemed he actually found creatures such as Xenomorphs to be cute. Odd as that may sound, it actually softened Fear's opinion of the hunter, as she felt the same. Shockingly, Fear and this hunter, who revealed his name to be Bustar Terminax, made a fast agreement to work together and kill no Xenomorphs they came across in those caves. I attempted to protest, stating how much more difficult it would make our mission, but Fear stated that she'd enjoy the challenge. My further protests were drowned out by the odd rantings between Fear and Terminax, and their shared affection for generally horrific and monstrous things. Fear described the appearance of some of the demons that she'd created back in her own world in great detail, and Terminax's response was, "You're one sick little freak, kid, and I dig it. Is it weird that I kinda want to adopt you?"
Sort of, considering that I'm actually over 700 years old.
Huh, well you're aging well. You could actually adopt me then. Actually, come to think of it, you and my old man would probably get on real well. He's a borderline psychopathic warlord. Or, at least he used to be anyway. Astoundingly, she took that as a compliment, and despite his disdain for killing creatures such as Xenomorphs, he apparently had no problem with sentient beings being killed. He stated, "Animals and monsters don't know better than to kill and hunt, it's just in their nature. They're doing what they were born and bred to do. Sentient beings, on the other hand, they do something bad enough even though they should know better. Sometimes they forfeit their right to keep on breathing." That was admittedly somewhat comforting to hear for myself, as I imagined Terminax may very well agree with my plan for the overseers of the multiverse, though that itself was not enough to sway me in one direction or the other in terms of my decision. Anyhow, I began to insist that Fear utilize the orb shard I'd brought to enhance her powers and ensure she could not be killed unexpectedly by a lurking Xenomorph. But she still seemed disinterested. It was quite odd, as while she may have immense power in her own world, as with myself, her abilities are limited when visiting other dimensions. She is able to summon demonic tendrils by placing her limbs against various surfaces, can hover though not at particularly dramatic speeds, and can make most beings and creatures feel violently nauseous and sick by staring into their eyes or standing in close proximity to them while activating this power. I thought because of this, her skills, especially with her tendrils, would be much more limited when we came to an underground lake, in the depths of which we could clearly make out more aquatic Xenomorphs. Terminax stated that his own scans of these caverns revealed that this water body actually hovered off the ground. At its bottom was not a solid floor, but it opened into the air above another set of caverns. The only way through to the Xenoforge was to swim down. The swim was roughly 400 meters. Terminax had in a bag he carried a hydrogram suit, which allowed him to breathe underwater, and Fear seemed unconcerned by the swim as well, but all the same, I took a few moments to utilize the multiversal orb to make Fear and myself air pockets around our heads that would allow us to breathe during the descent. Of course, while I was in the process of constructing this, more Xenomorphs came forth. Some were similar to the teal-armored one we'd seen before, and another set of 4 appeared as centaur-like creatures with bioluminescent protrusions and membranes spawning from them. These ones seemed rather intelligent and able to learn quickly, as Terminax altered between the flaming end of his weapon and the electrocution end. They dove into the water to avoid the flames, then splashed at him with their tails to try and dampen the end of the weapon and cease its flames. He electrocuted the water near them, but it seemed to have little effect. They also learned to keep their tails as far from Fear's tendrils as they could, so they could keep their bladed ends free to slice through any demonic limbs she sent at them to grab them. Fear stayed very close to me as I worked, watching for any xenomorphs that approached so she could protect me. One of the teal creatures managed to get close enough to Bustar to hammer its tail against his back, sending him hurtling into the lake. But soon after, I finished making the air bubbles for Fear and myself, and we dove in after him, all descending into the depths, with swarms of xenomorphs approaching to tear us to shreds. Terminax's rebreather suit was able to propel him at rapid speeds through the water, so he was able to dodge around the approaching creatures and swim towards us. He grabbed us each by the hand and pulled us downward, stating, "You two better keep those things off me or we're all xeno food." I was able to utilize my abilities to propel the magma-crusted flesh off my body to repel many of the encroaching creatures. But I assumed Fear would be little help, as she had no surface on which to place her limbs and summon tendrils. Strangely though, as a xenomorph approached her, before I could protect her, a tendril was able to spawn from her stomach and knock the creature off course. It was something I'd never seen her do outside her own universe, or without access to the multiversal orb, which was still firmly stuck to my belt and she was not in physical contact with. With both of us able to hold off the creatures, we finally made it to the bottom of the waters and emerged, upside down, falling another 30 feet towards the stony ground. Fear caught me and hovered us to the floor, but Bustar spun through the air and landed nimbly on his feet. None of the aquatic xenomorphs followed us through the bottom of the lake, but that did not mean we were free from danger. Terminax revealed that it was still an hour's walk or so through more caves to get to the final cavern where the forge likely rested. I speculated that I could teleport us to the location if given enough time with the orb shard, but my impatient party pushed on anyhow. That may have been for the best, as teleporting into unfamiliar terrain, especially in a cavern where you could spawn yourself into a wall, can be quite dangerous, even with a weapon as powerful as the multiversal orb. As we moved, Fear asked Terminax something that I could tell was some kind of leading question.
So, Bustar, what do you think of the Safety Commission? Wouldn't this universe be much better if they were dealt with?
An odd question, I thought, seeing as how she clearly had some sort of allegiance with them. But Bustar was unaware of this and responded, "You bet, those guys are monsters. Worse than anything I ever hunted. They'll destroy whole planets on a whim for barely any good reason. They block multiversal travel even though we're one of the few universes that has the tech for it figured out, and we could take resources to other universes who need it. Plus, I'm pretty sure they just brainwash people into joining them against their will. Someday someone is going to take them out, and I'd happily join in that fight."
What if I told you that every universe has something like a Safety Commission? In most cases, it's just one person, but they try to control everyone and everything in their universe, and will cause havoc and destruction just for the fun of it, to see how the people of their worlds react.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about, like facilitators or overseers or something like that, right? Wait, are you saying that's what the Safety Commission is? Figures. I say they should all go. Let people live their lives for good or bad on their own rules.
I agree. And what if I told you that Dresden here has been working on a way to get rid of them for a long time, but now he's not sure if he wants to go through with it?
I had not realized that my hesitation about our plans had become clear to Fear herself. I take pride in being a very difficult-to-read person, and yet somehow she had clearly realized my conviction was waning. Bustar suddenly stopped his march and turned to me. "Look, pal, if there's something I've learned over the last couple years, it's that if you've spent a long time knowing you gotta do something, just do it and deal with whatever consequences come. I spent years knowing that I didn't want to kill the critters I was hunting, but kept doing it anyway, cause I was scared of what other folks would think about me. So I just kept being who I thought they wanted me to be. And I never actually got to a point where I knew for sure what the right thing to do was, but I just decided if I'd been thinking about it for so long, I just had to go for it, or it was gonna keep nagging at me. When I finally did it, it lost me the respect of pretty well every hunter I ever wanted to impress before, but at least I finally feel like I'm being me, you know? A lot of folks are gonna try and tell you what you gotta do is wrong or stupid or whatever, but you do you and let other people deal with it or leave you. If they don't respect you for doing it, then flarg them. They can kick rocks. Besides, a multiverse with less folks like the Safety Commission Sounds like a better place for everyone to me. A small voice in the back of my mind wanted me to point out to him that it was entirely likely that this plan would involve killing a few overseers that were in fact decent beings, but I was too enraptured by a new ally asserting that what I'd been planning for so long was the right thing to do. I told him, "Thank you, Bustar. That is helpful and I will take it into consideration." It felt like a reassuring moment, but only briefly until Fear said,
Oh, he's good. Now I just need him to talk you into letting me bring in the Archons to help us.
Now, I make an asserted effort to never lose my temper at Fear, but when it comes to those entities, I cannot often hold back my anger. I said, "Enough about the Archons. There will never be a justifiable reason to grant them physical form." Of course, Bustar was confused about what we were on about, so I explained that the Archons are a group of 7 demonic entities originally created to construct the very fabric of the multiverse we live in. But after creating the multiverse, they wanted nothing more than to come into it in physical form themselves and bring death upon the beings that resided in it. They envy sentient life for being able to live in worlds they originally built. They also envy the imagination of sentient beings of the multiverse, as, although they seem to be powerful creators themselves, they were only able to build anything by tapping into the Akashic records. They simply created altered imitations of physical realities that were, allegedly, past incarnations of our very multiverse. They are psychopathic entities that are obsessed with deception and death, and if they were able to take physical form, they could likely bring about the end of every sentient being in existence. Thankfully, the only way to possibly grant physical forms to these beings would be with a piece or whole of the multiversal orb, one piece of which I carried in that moment. Of course, Terminax, upon hearing this, promptly replied, "Well, yeah, that sounds like a pretty bad idea to me then, kid. Sorry, but I'm on the grouchy guy's side on this one." Fear attempted to assert that I was exaggerating, but before the argument could continue, we were interrupted. A swarm of a dozen Xenomorphs, possibly drawn by our bickering, clambered down the tunnel toward us, led by a group of 3 that had flames bursting from their tails and chests, suggesting that Terminax's primary weapon would do little to ward them off. Fear was able to use her tendrils to batter and distract many of the Xenomorphs, as Bustar attempted to render as many as possible unconscious with his discs. Unfortunately, the first he threw onto one of the flaming Xenomorphs promptly burned and sparked and fell to the ground, leaving him with only 7 remaining. Fear did her best to grab the Xenomorphs who were still conscious and hurl them behind us out of our path, then use her tendrils to create a temporary barrier that they could not follow us back through. Terminax retrieved his discs from the Xenomorphs he had struck, as I utilized the multiversal orb to enhance the strength of my powers. I shot the stony flesh off my arms with elevated ferocity at the ceiling between us and the creatures, causing it to cave in, blocking the way from which we'd come and trapping the creatures on the other side. Terminax was angry at first about how we could no longer escape, but I assured him that we could transport ourselves out as soon as we'd completed our task. We made our way farther in, fending off more and more Xenomorphs before finally coming to the base of the caves. There we found a towering machine. It was a rugged circular structure surrounded by 10 round platforms. On 2, there were living alien beings, held in place by mechanical claws that sprung up from the ground beneath, and on the face of each was the type of creature that injects a Xenomorph embryo into one's body. Terminax stated, "I recognize this tech. Already kinda suspected this, but it was probably built by this rogue Yautja, a mad scientist. Pretty sure he's been dealt with already by his own people, but guess he built this machine with some powerful failsafes." To my surprise, Terminax marched towards one of the bound beings and plunged the electric end of his spear through their heart. "No saving them now. Better they die fast than have a Xeno dig its way out of their chest and kill them slow." He moved on to the next, but as he impaled them, a massive purple tail swung around the machine and struck Terminax. He flew through the air, but again spun around and landed on his feet. We were then faced with the largest xenomorph yet, approaching 50 feet in length and having 11 limbs, including its tail. Terminax hurled one of his discs onto the creature and it landed, but had no effect. He hurled on 2 more, but still nothing. It seemed they would be ineffective against this particular creature. My abilities were still enhanced by the orb, so I promptly shot my flesh forth at the creature's head, but it thrust upwards 6 of its limbs to block the blows. Even with my elevated strength, I was able to do little damage. It even caught much of the flying parts of my body and held them tight enough that I could not call them back or further control them. Fear attempted to send tendrils through the ground to grab hold of the creature, but it was strong enough to pull itself free. It finally released the pieces of my arm as it crawled up onto the ceiling towards the area above where Fear was controlling her tendrils. I recalled my flesh and ran towards her to guard her, when more xenomorphs began emerging from the tunnels around us. We were being swarmed, and were likely to be slain in a matter of minutes. I considered opening a portal back to my own world to take us all through, when Fear revealed that she had been holding back all this time. As the purple xenomorph clawed directly over her, she flared her eyes upwards and from the ceiling spawned a massive demonic shark head that bit into the stomach of the xenomorph, tore it off its perch and hurled it back to the ground, crushing 2 approaching creatures. She pulled her hands free from the ground and propelled them towards a set of 5 xenomorphs approaching Bustar, and a purple aura suddenly appeared around them all, causing them to collapse to the ground in agony. I couldn't understand how she was summoning so much power, until it struck me that many of these abilities were things she could utilize while holding the multiversal orb. On a dreadful suspicion, I activated the vision that overseers have access to see the underlying energy of all things, and was horrified to see that there was some kind of direct link, a tendril of energy moving from the multiversal orb shard I carried directly to Fear herself. She was channeling its energy without touching it. Worse still, I could see a similar channeling energy within her, but breaking forth to another dimension. My dimension. Not only was she pulling strength from the shard I had with me, but she was pulling strength from the orb shard I'd left back safely in my own world. This suggested that in any time, in any space, she could summon strength from the most powerful objects in the multiverse. I was too concerned with this to partake much in the battle, but as more xenomorphs came onto the scene, Fear stopped abiding by her agreed no-kill policy. She summoned demonic maws from the walls to tear the xenomorphs to pieces, to the great distress of Bustar. He tried to assault her, but she easily summoned demonic bonds to hold him in place.
Sorry, Catboy, but I value my own life more than the lives of these little creatures.
She then bound his mouth to keep him from protesting further, and he was forced to watch in horror as she eviscerated every xenomorph in sight. After a few moments, the last xenomorph left was the largest, but it was strapped down by a set of massive tendrils, and Fear summoned a monstrous head that looked like a xenomorph itself to bite the creature's skull and crush it. I finally regained composure enough to march over to her and demand answers. How are you doing this? When did you gain the ability to channel the orbs from afar?
Oh, you noticed that, huh? Just relax, my love. It's just a little safety procedure I put in place when you let me use them before. Just a little quantum entanglement, in case I ever needed them in a situation like this. It worked out, didn't it?
But I was not ignoring the signs any longer. I knew what this kind of ability could mean. Arava, I need you to look me in the eyes and swear on your life that you have not already begun crafting physical forms for the Archons. There was a slight pause, far longer than there should have been. Then she said,
Dresden, my love, you asked me not to. Don't you trust me?
But in that moment, I knew I didn't. Whether or not she was lying about this, she was clearly hiding things from me. The only person I thought was in full alignment with my goals suddenly felt like a stranger, and a dangerous one at that. My mind quickly flashed back to the first great betrayal I'd ever faced thousands of years ago, and this felt as though it were setting me up for something all too similar. I was quiet for the rest of the day's events. I created a portal large enough to send the Xenoforge into my own world to store it safely away in Baxel's prison. Fear kept Bustar bound as he was clearly going to attempt to kill her for going back on her word. She eventually transported herself back to her own dimension, and I teleported myself and Terminax to the surface, where we'd entered the cavern, so he could make it back to his ship. He was clearly not pleased with me either for allowing Fear to do what she'd done to those Xenomorphs. He marched off without so much as another word. I was then left alone, and truly felt as such. And so, despite being in a distressed state, or possibly even prompted by it, I decided then and there whether I'd actually move forward and kill the 16,000 overseers I'd created bonds with over the course of my life. And, well, I suppose you already know the rest.
Dresden looked up and for the first time since starting his story, made direct eye contact with Unkillable Kate. She still had the same deadpan expression she'd had when he'd started the tale. It was as if she hadn't moved a single muscle the entire time. He was genuinely shocked that she'd allowed him to tell the whole story and that she hadn't once interrupted.
Caitlin, I'm not certain if Sterling has told you what I once said to him, but I hope you know that I do regret what I did to you.
Finally, that prompted her to stand up and walk out of the ring of energy keeping Dresden trapped in the basement of the shark tank. That response didn't surprise him. Regardless of whether he'd chosen to kill the Overseers or not, he knew it likely wouldn't have changed her view of him in the slightest. And so, he was left alone once more to wonder, had he made the right decision or not? We're hitting a big turning point in the Multiverse Tales storyline. Gonna get 3 Multiverse Tales over the next couple months, but before I get into talking about that, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who submitted for this episode, and a special thank you to the people who ended up getting their aliens selected. CJ Schnell, Doodlenyx, FinFisk, and Liam Pursian. They were awesome designs, and I think they turned into some super cool Xenomorphs, some of my favorites that I've ever done. But now, as I hinted at the start of this episode, I'm actually announcing the next 2 community redraws, because they're actually going to be back-to-back episodes that come out at the end of October. So you're going to have a little bit longer to submit for your designs, and there won't technically be a redraw in September, but there will be 2 at the end of October. In the description of this episode, there's a Google Docs document with descriptions of 8 different characters that I want you to pick one and design what you think that character should look like. I'm actually going to be taking the submission and turning it into something else, something very related to that thing, but I don't want to spoil it and announce it in this episode, so, just follow the instructions. And make sure you're submitting to popcrossanimations@gmail.com. There will be a Multiverse Tales episode at the end of September, but it's not going to be community redraw related. Admittedly, I don't actually know for sure what I'm going to draw for it, besides a new version of Kate with that Buster sword I mentioned she got in Dinosaur Demons Part 4, but I'll figure that out. Anyway, very excited to see what you all submit. All the art and inks from this are up on Patreon. I'll be doing a Design Notes podcast episode on this video to come out on the PopCross Studios Patreon on Wednesday. That's linked in the description if you're interested, but besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is a line I heard this week from a man named Andre Ducombe, who does a podcast that I really like called Know Thyself. And he said, when we get quiet, what needs to be heard becomes loud. This is essentially one of the reasons that I find meditation so useful, because when you do your best to quiet your mind, thoughts are still gonna come up. And if you're new to something like meditation, one of the first thoughts to come to you is probably going to be something negative. That is something that's often churning in the background of your mind, making you uncomfortable without you actually being conscious of the fact that it's there. So it might be a bit uncomfortable to sit there and acknowledge that that's coming up for you, but knowing that that's an issue for you and that's where your mind goes when it's at rest is good, because it means you can address it and heal from it. I hope that's inspiring. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday. Goodbye.